Morning Brew.
At this place in history, we're on Poor Farm Road in Colchester with Steve Perkins, the executive director of the Vermont Historical Society. Steve, we're right next to what is now Paul Mazza's berry farm. So what brings us here this week?
Early social services for Vermont residents. The berry farm is on the site of what used to be Colchester's Poor Farm. England had almshouses and poor houses.
Indeed.
And I think when you think Charles Dickens and going to the poorhouse, well, that's exactly what happened here. There weren't statewide services, and so all of that responsibility was put back on town municipalities. Now we're in Vermont, and it's rural, so whereas in a city you may have a poor house that takes care of the poor, we created poor farms. And usually they were away from the village centers, outside of town, not on great land, places where no one else really wanted to be. Vermont even put this into law as far back as 1797.
Could we then imply from that at one time or another, at least, every town in Vermont or close to it would have had such a farm?
They may not have had the facilities of a farm, Mike, but they all had an overseer of the poor, which was a town office. And so early on, what the overseer of the poor would do is they would, if somebody needed help, they would assign them to, a farm or a home of somebody in town. And over time that got abused, and it was almost like slavery, that the overseer would receive funds for placing the poor at a farm to work as an indentured servant for a period of time until their debts were paid off. And I think that was a real problem. And so that's why towns started to create these institutions. They started to become this place where the sick and certainly the mentally ill and the elderly all ended up. There are almost 100 of them throughout the state of Vermont by the 1880s.
It would probably surprise a lot of people to learn just how long many of them existed.
Yes, I mean, they certainly declined in number, but 1967, Vermont finally repealed this law. That following year in 1968, the last poor farm, which was in Sheldon, closed. But they started to decline, certainly in the 1930s, but even around 1900. And so a big part of that was, as I said, a lot of the people with mental illness were housed in the poor farms. We started to see the Vermont State Hospital open in Waterbury in the 1880s, the Brattleboro Retreat around the same time. And so the poor farms more and more became almost like elderly housing. They almost became nursing homes in a way. But then in the 1930s, Social Security was enacted. Now we get to the 1950s, 1960s, and there are even more federal programs. Food stamps, Medicare, that helps take care of people. And that finally you see the end of this poor farm. But like I said, 1968, the last one closed. I mean, Burlington's poor farm closed in 1958. It was on the site of what's now the C.P. Smith School in the old North End. Colchester's closed in the 40s. But the big cities and towns, Montpelier, Brattleboro, Rutland, Burlington, they held on to them for a long time. I just like old maps, and you can often see they're labeled. Sometimes they're labeled poor farm. Often they're labeled the quote-unquote town farm. And so if you look on an old map of Colchester, you'll see, right here where we're standing, it says the town farm. So you can find those. Go to your town. Look in the old town reports, and you'll find overseer of the poor and information on how that worked. We've published some great articles. You can find them on our website through our library on the history of poor farms in Vermont.
Outdated social services that are still on Vermont's landscape at this place in history.
This is Fox 40